The rain fell on Chicago not as water but as a judgment. It was a furious vertical assault, turning the streets into churning gray rivers and the sky into a bruised perpetual twilight. Each thunderclap felt less like a sound and more like a physical blow against the city's steel and glass bones. Inside the emergency room of Chicago Memorial Hospital, the storm was a distant percussive roar, a soundtrack to a more intimate and pressing chaos. The air was thick with the smells of antiseptic wet wool and fear. Machines beeped in a frantic, discordant symphony, while the PA system crackled with disembodied voices calling for doctors who were already moving faster than humanly possible. Gurneys rattled over linoleum slick with tracked-in rainwater, their wheels squeaking in protest. It was a perfectly controlled disaster, an ecosystem that thrived on the edge of collapse. In a small alcove, partially shielded from the main thoroughfare of trauma, stood two men. They were an island of focused tension in the swirling sea of emergency. The first, Dr. Michael Foster, was a man wearing the ghost of his profession. His surgical scrubs were wrinkled, a map of the 36 hours he had spent within these walls. He was tall and had the broad shoulders of a man once athletic, but they were stooped now, bent under an invisible crushing weight. His face, usually a mask of calm, surgical confidence, was etched with a raw and desperate exhaustion. The faint stubble on his jaw was silver, a recent development that had appeared in the last few years, marking time not in seasons, but in increments of lost hope. The second man, Dr. Alan Harrison, was his opposite. As the head of pediatric neurology, he wore his authority like his tailored lab coat, perfectly white, immaculately pressed, and without a single crease. His silver hair was sculpted, his posture ramrod straight. He looked at the chaos of the ER with a detached clinical disdain, as if it were a poorly managed experiment he was being forced to observe. To Harrison, the world was a collection of symptoms to be diagnosed, problems to be categorized, and in many cases unfortunate realities to be accepted. He dealt in certainties, not miracles. Between them, a silent 7-year-old testament to their conflict, sat Emma Foster. She was strapped into a highly advanced pediatric wheelchair, a throne of chrome and cushioned supports that seemed more like a cage. Her body was frail, her limbs held in a state of rigid stillness by a disease that had locked her away from the world. Her dark hair was cut in a neat bob, framing a pale, doll-like face, but it was her eyes that held the true tragedy. They were wide and blue, the color of a winter sky, and they stared blankly ahead, seeing nothing, connecting with nothing. They were the eyes of a child who was present in body, but absent in spirit. "You are not listening to me." Alan Michael Foster said, his voice a low, frayed wire of sound. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. I saw it. A flicker. In her hand. When the nurse was adjusting her blanket, Harrison sighed a sound of profound and weary impatience. "Michael, we have been over this 100 times. They are involuntary muscle spasms, postural reflexes, not conscious movement. The scans are unequivocal. The cerebral damage is extensive and permanent. These are phantom signals in a system that has been irreparably compromised." Each clinical term was a stone Harrison threw, building a wall between a father's hope and a doctor's reality. Michael shook his head, a gesture of stubborn denial. It was different this time. It wasn't a twitch. It was a reach. A faint one, but it was there. "I know my own daughter. You know the daughter you wish you had." Harrison corrected his tone, softening just enough to make the words cut even deeper. "You are a surgeon, Michael. You understand the mechanics of the human body better than anyone. You know what the MRI reports say. You have seen the EEG readings. Hope is not a viable treatment strategy. Acceptance is the only course of action that will grant you any peace." Peace. The word was so absurd, so insulting that Michael almost laughed. Peace was a foreign country he had been exiled from 3 years ago, the day Emma's laughter had been replaced by a vacant silence. "So that's it. We just manage her decline. We watch her fade away in this chair while you quote textbooks at me. I quote medical science." Harrison stated, his voice regaining its sharp, authoritative edge. "And I suggest you stop torturing yourself with these fantasies. It is not productive for you, and it creates unrealistic expectations among the staff." He glanced at his watch, a slim, expensive timepiece. "I have a board meeting in 10 minutes. My final recommendation stands. Continue the current regimen of physical therapy to prevent muscular atrophy and manage her nutrition. There is nothing more to be done." The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut, locking Michael alone in the dark with his dying hope. He looked down at Emma, at her small, still form, and a wave of impotent fury washed over him. He was one of the finest surgeons in the country. He could hold a human heart in his hands, mend it, and command it to beat again. Yet he could do nothing to reach his own child. It was at that precise moment of despair that a new figure entered their small bubble of conflict. A young paramedic, her face flushed from the wind, and rain guided a gurney into the alcove. On it sat a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He was small for his age, with clothes that were worn and soaked through, clinging to his thin frame. His skin was the color of rich, dark earth. There was a small, clean cut on his forehead, a minor wound from a piece of flying debris, the paramedic explained. The boy's name was Jerome Williams. He said nothing. He simply sat on the gurney, his worn sneakers dangling inches from the floor, and he watched. Most children in his situation would be crying or scared, overwhelmed by the noise and the sight of blood and pain. But Jerome was unnervingly still. His eyes, dark and profoundly deep, took in the scene with a quiet, analytical intensity. He saw the surgeon's anguish, the neurologist's arrogance, and the little girl's stillness. He absorbed the entire history of their pain in a single sweeping gaze. A nurse bustled over to tend to Jerome's cut, speaking to him in a soft, cooing voice. He answered her questions politely, his voice low but clear. He did not flinch when she cleaned the wound. All the while, his attention remained fixed on the two doctors and the child in the wheelchair. Harrison, having delivered his verdict, turned to leave. He gave a curt nod to Michael, a gesture of final dismissal. "We'll speak next week." Michael didn't answer. He slumped against the wall, the fight draining out of him, leaving a hollow ache in its place. He had lost. Science had won. Hope was dead. He looked at Emma's blank face and whispered, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Harrison paused, his back still mostly turned. He spoke over his shoulder, his voice loud enough for the nearby nurses to hear. "There is nothing to be sorry for, Michael. You cannot fix what is fundamentally broken." The words, laced with an air of public pity, were a final casual cruelty, and they were the ones that finally broke the boy's silence. Jerome slid off the gurney. The nurse attending to him let out a small gasp of surprise. He took 3 deliberate steps forward, his wet sneakers making no sound on the polished floor. He stopped a few feet from the 2 celebrated physicians, a small rain-soaked child who had no right to be there, no right to an opinion. He looked past the formidable Dr. Harrison and directly at the heartbroken Dr. Foster. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of a child. It was calm, steady, and held a resonance of ancient certainty that made the air around it seem to still. "You cannot fix her," Jerome said, his gaze unwavering, "because you are looking in the wrong place." The emergency room, with its symphony of chaos, seemed to fall silent for a single, impossible heartbeat. The paramedic stared, her mouth slightly agape. The nurse froze her hand, hovering in midair. Michael Foster lifted his head, his eyes widening in stunned disbelief. Dr. Alan Harrison turned slowly, his face a mask of incredulous fury. His mind, so adept at categorizing and dismissing, struggled to process what had just happened. A street urchin, a piece of urban flotsam washed in by the storm, was daring to challenge him. In his hospital, in his domain. "What did you just say?" Harrison's voice was dangerously low, a viper's hiss. Jerome did not flinch. He did not look at Harrison. His focus remained entirely on Michael Foster, as if they were the only 2 people in the room. He was speaking a language of pure hope from one soul who understood to another who was desperate to. "Her mind is not a broken machine." The boy continued, his voice soft but clear. "It's a locked room. You keep trying to smash the door down, but you just need to find the right key." The sheer audacity of the statement was breathtaking. Harrison's face contorted into a sneer of pure contempt. "And I suppose a child who smells of rain and poverty has this key." He took a menacing step forward. "You are in a place where you do not belong, boy, speaking of things you cannot possibly comprehend." He turned to the nearest orderly. "Security. Get this child out of my emergency room, now, before he contaminates something." Michael Foster remained frozen, paralyzed by a war of emotions. The surgeon in him agreed with Harrison. This was madness. The boy was likely delusional, a product of a traumatic life. but the father in him. The father clung to the boy's words like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. A locked room. The metaphor was so simple, yet it resonated with a truth that all of Harrison's medical jargon had failed to capture. Two security guards, large men with gentle but firm expressions, began to approach. They were used to dealing with distraught family members and confused patients, but this was new. Jerome finally turned his gaze from Foster to the girl in the wheelchair. He looked at Emma, and for the first time a flicker of something other than a child's wisdom appeared on his face. It was a profound, heartbreaking empathy. He saw not a collection of symptoms, but a person. "You think the storm is loud," he whispered almost to himself. But the silence inside her is louder. The guards reached him, placing gentle hands on his small shoulders. "Come on, son, let's go find your parents." Jerome didn't resist. He allowed them to turn him towards the exit. But as they led him away, he twisted his head back, his dark eyes locking one last time with Michael Foster's. The chaos of the ER began to rush back in the beeps and shouts and rattling wheels reclaiming the silence. But before he was gone, Jerome delivered one final cryptic message, a sentence that would embed itself in Michael's soul and haunt his every waking moment. "She is not broken," the boy said, his voice carrying over the din with impossible clarity. "She is just listening to a different melody." And then he was gone, escorted out into the raging storm, from which he came leaving behind a shattered surgeon, an enraged neurologist, and the deafening echo of a single impossible whisper of hope. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a city washed clean and unnervingly quiet. The sky, now a pale, fragile blue, seemed ashamed of its earlier violence. But for Dr. Michael Foster, the tempest had simply moved indoors. It raged behind his eyes, a relentless cyclone of two phrases spinning in a maddening loop: a locked room, a different melody. He sat in the sterile confines of his office, a space that usually brought him a sense of order and control. On his desk, illuminated by the cool light of a high-resolution monitor, were Emma's latest brain scans. They were intricate, monochrome images of defeat maps of a territory deemed uninhabitable by medical science. He saw the areas of cortical atrophy, the compromised neural pathways, the physiological proof of his daughter's prison. For 3 years, these images had been his gospel, the unassailable text from which Dr. Harrison preached his sermons of acceptance. Yet now they seemed incomplete. The boy's words had not erased the science, but they had superimposed a different kind of truth over it. A poetic, infuriating, and utterly unscientific truth that resonated in the hollow space where his hope had once lived. A locked room. It implied a door, a key, a different melody. It suggested not a broken instrument, but one that required a different musician. Michael pushed away from the desk, the chair's wheels protesting with a soft groan. He walked to the window, which overlooked a small manicured courtyard. He could see Harrison down below, walking with 2 residents, gesturing with crisp, authoritative movements. He looked exactly as he always did, confident, untouchable, a man for whom the world held no mysteries, only diagnoses. The sight filled Michael with a sudden acidic resentment. Harrison's certainty, once a comfort, now felt like a form of blindness. He had a map of the battlefield, but no understanding of the soldier. The boy, Jerome Williams. Michael had retrieved the name from the ER's brief admission log. Address listed as the St. Jude's shelter on the west side. No family contacts. Admitted for a minor laceration, treated and released. A ghost swept in and out by the storm, but ghosts leave things behind. This one had left behind a seed of dangerous, irrational hope. He knew what he had to do. It was a breach of protocol, a step outside the clean, logical lines of his profession, but he no longer cared. He needed to know. He needed to understand how a 10-year-old boy from a homeless shelter could look at his daughter and see not a tragedy, but a puzzle. He found Janet Miller near the end of her 12-hour shift, overseeing the morning rush at the Central Nurses Station. Janet was the hospital's heart and its memory. She had been at Chicago Memorial for 30 years, and she moved through its halls with an air of quiet, unshakable competence. Her hair was mostly gray, pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes, magnified by a pair of simple reading glasses, had seen everything from miraculous recoveries to heartbreaking losses. They held no judgment, only a deep, weary compassion. She was perhaps the only person in the hospital Michael trusted without reservation. "Janet," he began, keeping his voice low. "Can I have a word?" She took in his appearance, the exhausted eyes, the rumpled scrubs from the day before, and her expression softened. "Of course, Michael. Everything all right?" He led her to a small empty supply closet, the only place that offered a guarantee of privacy. The air smelled of bleach and sterile gauze. "I need a favor." He said the words feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. A personal one, completely off the record. Janet's gaze was steady. She simply waited. "There was a boy in the ER last night," he started. "Jerome Williams. He was brought in during the storm. I need to know his story. I need to know if he's okay." He tried to frame it as a professional concern, a doctor worried about a vulnerable child. But Janet saw through the pretense. She had been there last night. She had heard the whispers from the ER staff about the strange encounter about the boy who had silenced the great Dr. Harrison with a single sentence. She knew this was more than a welfare check. "The boy who spoke to you about Emma," she stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. Michael's shoulders sagged. There were no secrets from Janet. "Yes, that's the one." "You think he knows something?" "I think he sees something," Michael corrected, the distinction vital. "Something the rest of us are missing. Or maybe he's just a troubled kid projecting his own trauma. I don't know. That's what I need to find out. Can you just look into it discreetly? Find out where he came from, who he is." Janet was silent for a long moment, studying his face. She saw the desperation warring with the skepticism. She had watched Michael Foster evolve from a brilliant cocksure resident into a celebrated surgeon, and then into a broken father. She had also seen Dr. Harrison's star rise, his reputation built on a foundation of rigid, unyielding dogma. She knew the politics of this place better than anyone. "I'll see what I can find," she said finally, her voice imbued with a quiet promise, as one old friend to another. A wave of gratitude so intense it almost buckled his knees washed over Michael. "Thank you, Janet. Truly. Go home and get some sleep, Michael," she advised, her tone shifting from conspirator to nurse. "You're no good to anyone like this." As Michael finally left the hospital, squinting in the unfamiliar morning light, Dr. Harrison was holding court. He stood at the front of a glass-walled conference room, a rapt audience of 20 medical interns hanging on his every word. On the large screen behind him were Emma's scans, the same ones Michael had been staring at all night. "Observe, gentlemen," Harrison said, using a laser pointer to trace a shadowed region of the cerebral cortex. "Case study, 7B Emma Foster. A textbook presentation of severe spastic quadriplegia resulting from hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy at birth. The damage, as you can see, is profound and diffuse." He clicked to another slide, a series of charts and graphs. "What is most challenging in cases like this is not the medical management, which is quite straightforward, but the management of the family's expectations. Hope, while a noble human emotion, can be a significant impediment to effective palliative care. Our role as physicians is to present the data, the empirical truth, not to indulge in fanciful narratives of recovery." He paced before the screen, a portrait of intellectual superiority. "You will encounter parents like our own esteemed Dr. Foster, who are brilliant in their own fields, but who will abandon all logic in the face of such a diagnosis. They will see intention in a muscle spasm, a word in a random vocalization. They will look for miracles. Your job, your duty, is to gently but firmly guide them back to reality. The greatest kindness we can offer in these situations is the clear, unvarnished, and often painful truth." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the young, impressionable minds in the room. He was not just teaching medicine. He was teaching his philosophy, a philosophy where the data was God and any deviation was heresy. The incident in the ER had been an anomaly, a chaotic variable, and this lecture was his way of restoring order, of reinforcing the walls of his kingdom. Meanwhile, miles away, Janet Miller was beginning her search. It started with a few phone calls, her voice a calm, reassuring presence that could coax information from the most guarded city bureaucrats. She navigated the labyrinth of social services with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for 30 years, not for hospital business, but for patients who had no one else. The address on Jerome's file led her as expected to the St. Jude's shelter. It was a sturdy old brick building in a neighborhood the city had tried to forget, a place of quiet dignity amid the urban decay. The air inside smelled of soup and laundry detergent. It was a world away from the sterile, climate-controlled corridors of Chicago Memorial. Here, broken things weren't just managed. They were mended with patience and scarce resources. She found Jerome in the corner of a sparsely furnished common room. He was sitting in a worn armchair, his feet not quite touching the floor, engrossed in a tattered copy of a book. He looked up as she approached, his dark eyes showing no surprise, only a quiet recognition. "Hello, Jerome," Janet said softly, pulling up a simple wooden chair to sit opposite him. "I'm Janet. I'm a nurse from the hospital last night. I just wanted to make sure you were all right." "The cut is fine," he said, his voice as low and steady as she remembered. "They used a butterfly stitch." "I'm glad to hear it," she smiled. "That was quite a storm. It brings a lot of people to our doors." He nodded, his gaze dropping back to his book. He was not unfriendly, but he was guarded, a child who had learned early that the world was not a safe place. "Do you live here at the shelter?" Janet asked gently. "For now," he replied. "And your family?" A shadow passed over his face, so fleeting Janet might have missed it if she hadn't been watching so closely. "They're gone. My grandmother raised me. She's gone now, too." An ache of sympathy touched Janet's heart. An orphan, alone in the world. It explained the old soul quality in his eyes. "I'm very sorry to hear that. She must have been a wonderful woman to have raised such a bright young man." For the first time, a small, genuine smile touched Jerome's lips. "She was the smartest person I ever knew." "Was she a doctor or a teacher?" Janet probed, trying to understand the source of his strange confidence. "She was a nurse," Jerome said, a fierce pride in his voice. "Here, at Chicago Memorial. For a long, long time." Janet felt a small jolt of surprise. It was a connection, a plausible reason for his presence. Perhaps he was just a lonely boy, reaching out to the only world he knew, his grandmother's world. "Really? What was her name?" "I've been there for 30 years. I might have known her." Jerome looked at her, then a long, assessing gaze, as if trying to decide if she was worthy of the name he was about to speak. He seemed to find what he was looking for. He closed his book, marking his page with a finger. "Her name was Lily," he said. "Lily Williams." The name struck Janet Miller with the force of a physical blow. It was as if the drab, quiet shelter had suddenly dissolved around her, replaced by the ghost of the hospital as it had been 20 years ago. Lily Williams. It wasn't just a name. It was an incantation. It conjured the image of a woman with a wry smile, hands that could soothe a crying baby with a single touch, and eyes that saw straight through to the heart of a problem. Lily Williams. The nurse who could get children to respond when neurologists had given up. The woman who grew herbs in a window box in the staff lounge and used them to make calming teas. The legend who was whispered about by junior nurses, a figure of quiet rebellion, who healed with intuition and empathy as much as with medicine. And Janet remembered something else. She remembered the hushed, angry arguments Lily used to have behind closed doors with a brilliant but arrogant young attending physician who despised her methods and saw her as a threat to his by-the-book authority. A young doctor by the name of Alan Harrison. In that instant, the entire situation was reframed. This wasn't about a random troubled boy. This was about a legacy. Jerome Williams was not a ghost from the storm. He was the echo of a name. And Janet suddenly had the terrifying feeling that the real storm was just about to begin. The name hung in the air of the quiet common room, dense and heavy with history. Lily Williams. For Janet Miller, it was as if a key had turned in a long locked door in her memory, releasing a flood of images and sensations so vivid they momentarily eclipsed the present. The scent of lavender and chamomile from the teas Lily always brewed. The sound of her soft melodic humming as she calibrated a patient's monitor. The feel of her steady hand on Janet's shoulder 25 years ago, offering silent reassurance during a terrifying pediatric code. Lily had been more than a colleague, more than a friend. She had been Janet's anchor, her true north in the often impersonal world of modern medicine. When Janet was a young, terrified nurse drowning in a sea of protocols and intimidating doctors, it was Lily who had pulled her aside. "Forget the charts for a minute, dear," she had said, her voice a gentle balm. "Look at the child. Really look. What are their eyes telling you? What is their breathing saying? They will always tell you the truth long before the machines do." Lily Williams was the keeper of the hospital's soul, a practitioner of an older, quieter medicine. She was a healer in a building full of technicians, and that was precisely why Dr. Alan Harrison had destroyed her. Jerome watched Janet's face, his own expression unreadable, but patient. He saw the storm of memories in her eyes and seemed to understand, giving her the space to navigate it. "I knew your grandmother," Janet said finally, her voice thick with emotion. The words were a profound understatement. She was my mentor. She taught me how to be a nurse." A flicker of warmth entered Jerome's eyes. "Then you know," he said simply. "Yes," Janet whispered, "I know." She knew about the fierce, unwavering light of Lily's conviction, and she knew about the darkness that had extinguished it. The memory buried for over a decade under layers of professional duty and disillusionment surfaced now with painful clarity. It had been a boy named Daniel, a 6-year-old diagnosed by Harrison with a severe degenerative neuromuscular disorder. Harrison had been an attending physician then younger, but already radiating the same chillingly confident arrogance. His prognosis for Daniel was bleak, rapid deterioration, full paralysis within a year, a life spent on a ventilator. He prescribed an aggressive and painful regimen of drug therapies designed only to slow the inevitable. Lily had disagreed, quietly at first, then more forcefully. She had spent hours with Daniel, not just observing his symptoms, but playing with him, talking to him, listening. "It's not in his muscles, doctor," she had told Harrison during rounds, her voice respectful but firm. "It's in his spirit. The fear is what's paralyzing him. The treatments are making it worse." Harrison had looked at her as if she were speaking in tongues. He had publicly ridiculed her, calling her observations sentimental nonsense and a dangerous distraction from evidence-based medicine. He forbade her from interfering with Daniel's treatment plan. But Lily had never been good at following orders she believed were harmful. Working with Daniel's terrified parents, she began her own quiet therapy after Harrison had left for the day. She used music, gentle touch storytelling, and aromatherapy. She taught the boy breathing exercises to manage his pain and fear. Within weeks, the boy's so-called degeneration began to reverse. He started moving more freely. His appetite returned. His laughter echoed in a ward that had only known his pained cries. The change was so dramatic it could not be hidden. When Harrison discovered what Lily had done, his reaction was not joy at the child's improvement, but a cold, white-hot fury. His diagnosis had been proven wrong. His authority had been undermined by a nurse armed with nothing more than compassion and common sense. He couldn't abide it. He brought her before a disciplinary board, twisting her success into an act of reckless insubordination. He accused her of endangering a patient by deviating from a prescribed treatment. He used his eloquence, his command of medical jargon, and his burgeoning influence with the hospital administration to paint her as a sentimental old woman who had lost her professional objectivity. Lily, with her quiet dignity, refused to defend herself in their terms. "My evidence is the boy's laughter," she had said to the panel of grim-faced doctors. "My proof is that he is getting better." It wasn't enough. They offered her a choice, a formal censure on her perfect record, or a quiet early retirement. To protect the hospital from a potential lawsuit, and to spare herself the humiliation of a public condemnation, she chose to leave. She had walked out of the hospital she had served for over 30 years, with her head held high, leaving behind a void that for Janet had never truly been filled. And Daniel, handed back over to Harrison's exclusive care, had seen his progress stall. His parents eventually moving him to another facility in a different state. Janet never learned what became of him. He forced her out. Janet said the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. Harrison. He did it because he couldn't stand that she was right and he was wrong. She knew he would. Jerome said, his voice devoid of anger, holding only a deep, sad understanding. She said men like him are more afraid of being wrong than they are of failing to heal. She told me he built his kingdom on being the man with all the answers. A different answer is a threat to the whole kingdom. The boy's maturity, his grasp of the complex politics and personalities was astounding. He wasn't just repeating things he'd heard. He understood them on a fundamental level. He had been a student of more than just his grandmother's medical techniques. She knew this day would come, Jerome continued. A day when his kingdom would hurt someone he couldn't hide. Someone important enough that the walls might come down. He looked at Janet. She said when that day came, I would need proof, not just words. Jerome stood up from the armchair. Come with me. He led her through the shelter, past a dormitory filled with neatly made bunk beds and a kitchen where volunteers were chopping vegetables for dinner. His steps were sure, his purpose clear. He stopped in front of a bank of old dented metal lockers. He pulled a small worn key from his pocket and opened one. The locker was nearly empty. Inside was a change of clothes, a small stuffed animal, and a worn leather satchel that looked like it belonged to a doctor from another century. It was the kind of bag made from thick, supple leather softened with age and stitched by hand. Jerome lifted it out with a reverence that was almost religious. It was clearly his most prized possession, the only thing of value he had in the world. He carried it back to their chairs and placed it on the small table between them. With careful fingers he unbuckled the tarnished brass clasps. The scent that wafted out was the smell of Janet's past old paper dried herbs, and the faint sweet aroma of Lily Williams's lavender hand soap. Inside were not one, but 5 thick ledger-style notebooks. Their covers were worn, their corners soft with use. Jerome took one out and handed it to Janet. Its weight felt substantial, sacred. She opened it. The pages were filled with Lily's elegant looping script. It wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous, breathtaking record of a life's work. There were detailed patient observations, hand-drawn diagrams of neural and muscular pathways, and philosophical musings on the nature of healing. Tucked between the pages were pressed leaves and flowers, their colors faded, but their forms still perfect. Janet's eyes welled with tears as she traced a drawing of a child's hand notes in the margin, detailing how to use gentle pressure points to release tension. This was the knowledge Harrison had dismissed as sentimental nonsense. It was a treasure trove, a lost gospel of compassionate care. She called it her Book of Whispers. Jerome explained, his voice soft. She said that modern medicine had gotten very good at shouting with drugs, with surgeries, with machines, but it had forgotten how to listen. She said every child who was sick or in pain was whispering the answer to their own healing. You just had to be quiet enough to hear them. He pointed to a page in the book Janet was holding. That's Daniel, he said, the boy Dr. Harrison pushed her out for. Janet saw the detailed notes, the chronicle of Lily's secret therapy, the triumphant entry marking the return of his laughter. It was all there. The proof. She taught me how to read them, Jerome went on. How to see the patterns, how to recognize the whispers. She made me study them every day. After my parents died, it was all we had. The books and each other. His voice wavered for the first time, the 10-year-old boy finally showing through the armor of the old soul. He took a deep breath and regained his composure. Before she got sick, she made me a promise. She said that the world was full of loud doctors and quiet children. She said my job was to be a librarian for her whispers. She made me promise that if I ever found a child who was being failed, a child whose whisper was being ignored, that I would use her knowledge to speak for them. No matter how loud the doctors shouted. He looked up at Janet, his dark eyes burning with the solemnity of his mission. I've been watching Emma Foster for weeks from the sidewalk across the street. I heard her whisper the first time I saw her. It's the same one Daniel had. Dr. Harrison isn't just failing to heal her, he's silencing her. Janet closed the notebook, her hands trembling slightly. She looked from the priceless legacy on the table to the determined lonely boy in the chair opposite her. The pieces of the puzzle didn't just fit together, they formed a picture so clear and so damning it stole her breath. This was not a coincidence. This was a reckoning decades in the making. Her choice was clear. She could retreat back into the safety of her routine, protecting the career she had spent 30 years building. Or she could honor the memory of the woman who had taught her everything and stand with the boy who was her last best legacy. It wasn't really a choice at all. All right, Jerome. Janet said, her voice filled with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. It's time to make them listen. Janet sat with Jerome at a small, wobbly table in the shelter's dining hall. As the morning sun streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The 5 journals were stacked between them like bricks of a forgotten temple. They held the truth she knew, but truth was a fragile thing in a place like Chicago Memorial. It was not enough to possess it. One had to know how to wield it. She, a veteran nurse on the verge of retirement, and Jerome, a 10-year-old boy with the weight of the world on his shoulders, were not enough. They were too easily dismissed, the sentimental old woman and the traumatized child. Michael Foster was their target audience, the gatekeeper to any hope for Emma, but he was a surgeon, a man who lived and breathed data scalpels and science. His heart might be swayed by Jerome's words, but his mind, the mind of a physician, required a translator. They needed a doctor. Her thoughts sorting through the hospital's roster of physicians, discarded one name after another. Most were Harrison's allies' protégés, or were simply too timid to risk their comfortable careers by challenging the powerful head of neurology. But one name snagged in her mind, a spark of possibility. Dr. Rebecca Chun. Dr. Chun was a recent and brilliant addition to the neurology department, recruited from a prestigious Boston hospital. She was sharp-driven and possessed a restless, curious intellect that Janet had seen Harrison systematically try to dull ever since her arrival. Chun specialized in neuroplasticity and was a proponent of innovative integrative therapies ideas that Harrison publicly derided as New Age fads. Janet had seen the frustration in the young doctor's eyes during departmental meetings, the way she would bite her tongue when Harrison would shoot down a promising idea with a dismissive wave of his hand. More importantly, Janet had once overheard Dr. Chun in the cafeteria speaking with another junior doctor about the old legends of the hospital. She had mentioned Lily Williams by name, calling her a pioneering holistic practitioner whose work was tragically never documented. She admired the legend, but she didn't know the legend was real, that its proof was sitting on a wobbly table in a West Side shelter. Dr. Chun was their only hope. Getting to her required the subtlety of a spy. Janet couldn't just page her or schedule a meeting. Harrison monitored his department's activities with a paranoid vigilance. Instead, Janet waited for the right moment. It came the next afternoon. She saw Dr. Chun leaving the neurology wing, her shoulders slumped, her expression a familiar mask of controlled frustration. Janet knew she had likely just come from a meeting with Harrison. Janet intercepted her near a bank of elevators, feigning a chance encounter. Dr. Chun, a moment. Chun looked up, her intelligent dark eyes momentarily distracted. Janet. Of course. Is something wrong? No, not at all, Janet said, keeping her voice casual. Just an old nurse's curiosity. I was clearing out some old files from the archives and I came across some of the work of a former colleague. I thought of you. Her name was Lily Williams. Janet watched Chun's face carefully. The reaction was immediate. The frustration in her eyes was replaced by a keen academic interest. Lily Williams. Of course. I've heard stories. Quite the visionary from what I gather. It's a shame none of her research was ever formally published. Some of it was written down, Janet said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Just not in a medical journal. I wondered if you might be interested in seeing it. For its historical value, of course. Chun's professional curiosity was powerfully hooked. She looked around the busy corridor, sensing the need for discretion in Janet's tone. I would be very interested. When and where? The old wing library. Tonight. 8 o'clock, Janet suggested. The library was a dusty, forgotten repository of outdated textbooks and bound medical journals from the pre-digital age. No one ever went there. It was the perfect place for a conspiracy to be born. I'll be there, Chun said, a new energy in her voice. That evening the library was just as Janet remembered, silent, cavernous, and smelling of decaying paper and bindings. A single lamp cast a warm golden circle of light on a heavy oak table, creating an island of intimacy in the surrounding darkness. Janet had brought 2 of the journals. Jerome was waiting for her in the shelter. They had agreed that Janet should make the first approach alone, presenting the evidence before introducing the witness. Dr. Chun arrived precisely at 8, her lab coat exchanged for a simple sweater. She looked more like a graduate student than a department neurologist. Janet, she said, her voice hushed. Thank you for this. I feel like I'm about to see a rare historical document. You are, Janet said, pushing one of the journals into the pool of light. In more ways than you know. Chun sat down and pulled the book towards her, handling it with a scholar's care. She opened it, and for a long moment she was silent. Janet watched as the young doctor's expression shifted through several stages. First, professional skepticism as she scanned the elegant script and the notes about herbal remedies and music therapy. Then, deepening curiosity as she took in the incredibly detailed hand-drawn diagrams of nerve clusters and muscle groups, annotated with observations of a startling clarity. Finally, her face settled into an expression of profound, stunned respect. My God! Chun breathed, her fingers tracing a complex diagram of a child's spinal column. This is not the work of some New Age mystic. This is the work of a masterful clinician. Her observational skills are extraordinary. She was documenting subtle neurological responses that we've only recently been able to quantify with advanced EMG technology. She turned a page and her eyes widened. Is she tracking the patient's emotional state against their motor function recovery? The correlation is perfect. Who was this woman? She was the best nurse this hospital ever had, Janet said simply. And she was forced out for this very work. Janet let that statement hang in the air for a moment before she pushed the second journal forward, already open to a specific page. At the top, in Lily's clear hand, was the name Daniel R. and a date from 15 years ago. Read this case, Janet urged. A 6-year-old boy, diagnosed with a severe degenerative neuromuscular disorder, prognosis terminal decline. For the next half hour, the only sound in the library was the soft rustle of turning pages. Chun was no longer just reading. She was devouring the material, her scientific mind racing. She absorbed Lily's detailed account of how she had secretly worked with the boy, how she had identified his condition not as degenerative, but as a severe psychosomatic response to trauma that had created a feedback loop of fear and paralysis. Lily's notes chronicled his slow but steady recovery through her trust-based, non-invasive methods. When Chun finally looked up, her face was pale. "This is incredible. She saved him. Where are the hospital's official records for this case? I want to see how they documented this." Janet was prepared. She slid a thin file folder across the table. It contained photocopies she had carefully retrieved from the deep archives. Here is the official record. The attending physician was Dr. Alan Harrison. Chun opened the file. The contrast was stark and sickening. Harrison's notes were brief, clinical, and cold. They documented a patient who showed minor anomalous fluctuations, but whose condition remained fundamentally unchanged. The file concluded with a note stating the family had transferred the patient to another facility against medical advice. There was no mention of his recovery, no mention of Lily's intervention. It was a complete fabrication, a lie preserved in the hospital's official history. He erased her. Chun whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and fury. He erased her work and stole this boy's recovery from the record books. Why? Because he was the one who diagnosed him as a hopeless case, Janet said, her voice hard as steel. Her success was his failure. Now came the final crucial step. Janet pulled a tablet from her bag and opened Emma Foster's electronic medical file. She placed it on the table next to Lily's open journal and Daniel's falsified record. "Now look at Emma," Janet said. "Look at Harrison's initial diagnosis, the terminology he uses, the prognosis he gives, the treatment plan he has refused to alter for 3 years." Chun's eyes darted back and forth between the 3 documents, the whisper of truth from the past, the official lie, and the current tragedy. Her mind, trained to see patterns, connected the dots with terrifying speed. The language was the same. The rigid certainty was the same. The dismissal of any contradictory observations was the same. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, a methodology. Harrison wasn't just a doctor with a single blind spot. He was a man who, when faced with a reality that contradicted his diagnosis, chose to erase the reality rather than admit he was wrong. She looked at Janet, a fire now blazing in her eyes that had not been there an hour before. The frustrated, marginalized doctor was gone, replaced by a warrior. This was no longer an academic exercise. It was a call to arms. "He's not treating Emma." Chun said, the words falling from her lips with the weight of a verdict. "He's managing his own narrative. He's been doing it for years." She finally understood the magnitude of what Janet had brought her. This was career suicide. To challenge Harrison on this was to declare war on the most powerful man in their division, a man protected by the hospital's board and his own carefully constructed reputation. She would be ostracized, her own career potentially ruined. But then she looked down at the open journal, at the grace and wisdom in Lily's handwriting, and she thought of the little girl in the wheelchair, trapped not only by her condition, but by the arrogance of a powerful man. The risk to her career seemed insignificant compared to the moral certainty of what she had to do. Chun slowly closed the journal and slid it back towards Janet. She took a deep breath, her decision made. The alliance was forged in that silent, dusty room, an unseen, unspoken pact between the past and the present. "He has to be stopped," Rebecca Chun said, her voice quiet but ringing with the clarity of a bell. "Tell me everything about the boy." The silence in Michael Foster's house was a physical presence. It was a perfect architect-designed silence, insulated by triple-paned windows and the vast manicured lawn that separated the stone facade from the quiet suburban street. It was a silence bought with the immense success of his surgical career, and it had become his personal hell. It was the sound of a life that had everything but the one thing that mattered, the sound of a child's laughter. 3 days had passed since the encounter in the emergency room. 3 days of Michael walking through these beautiful silent rooms, the boy's words echoing in the vast emptiness. A locked room, a different melody. The phrases had become the rhythm of his own haunted thoughts. He would sit for hours in the living room watching Emma. She sat in her wheelchair near the great bay window, bathed in the soft afternoon light, a perfect portrait of a sleeping princess. But she was not sleeping. She was simply absent. His phone buzzed, shattering the quiet. The caller ID read Dr. A. Harrison. Michael's jaw tightened. He let it ring 4 times before answering a small, petty act of resistance. Michael Harrison's voice was smooth, infused with a patronizing sympathy that set Michael's teeth on edge. "I'm calling about the paperwork for the Northwood facility. They have an opening in their pediatric wing, a lovely place. I really think it's time we moved forward. It's the best thing for her. And for you." Northwood. The name was so gentle, so pastoral. It was a place where Chicago's wealthiest families sent their incurable children to be managed to live out their quiet, comfortable, hopeless lives. It was a beautiful prison. Signing that paperwork was not a step forward. It was a final surrender, an admission that the boy in the ER was a hallucination, and Harrison's gospel of despair was the only truth. "I'm still reviewing it." Alan Michael lied, his voice flat. The paperwork was sitting on his desk untouched. "There's nothing to review," Harrison said with a sigh of practiced patience. "It's the logical next step. Michael, you must stop this. This fixation you've developed since that incident in the ER is unhealthy. It was a disturbed child, nothing more. Don't let him undermine years of rational, evidence-based care. My daughter is not a case file, Alan." The words erupted from Michael with a force that surprised him. A cold silence met his outburst. "I will call you tomorrow to discuss this when you are feeling more rational," Harrison said, his tone dropping several degrees. The line went dead. Michael stared at the phone, his hand trembling with a mixture of rage and helplessness. Harrison was right about one thing. He was not being rational. He was a man of science, a surgeon who trusted observable facts, and he was clinging to the cryptic words of a homeless child. It was insane. And yet, it was the only thing that had felt true in years. Just as he was about to sink back into his despair, the phone buzzed again. This time it was Janet Miller. "Michael," her voice was low and urgent. "We have something. Something you need to see. Dr. Chun and I. Can we come to you? It's not a conversation for the hospital." The request was a profound breach of professional boundaries, yet it felt like a lifeline. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Now." An hour later, they stood in his marble-floored entryway. Janet, her face etched with a grave seriousness he had never seen before. Dr. Rebecca Chun looking nervous but resolute. And the boy, Jerome, who stood silently between them, his presence filling the grand space with a quiet, unnerving power. Michael led them into his study. It was his sanctuary, a room paneled in dark cherry wood, lined with shelves of medical textbooks and plaques from his distinguished career. It was a shrine to logic and achievement. He hoped its atmosphere would ground him, protect him from the irrational hope churning in his gut. "What is this, Janet?" he asked, his tone wary. Bringing Dr. Chun, Harrison's own junior neurologist, into this was a dangerous escalation. "This is a consultation, Michael," Janet said, her voice steady. "The kind that should have happened 3 years ago." Dr. Chun stepped forward, clutching a tablet. She was clearly nervous, but her voice was professional and precise. "Dr. Foster, I'd like to begin by stating that I have the utmost respect for Dr. Harrison's work. However, in reviewing your daughter's case alongside some historical hospital records provided by Janet, I have developed an alternative hypothesis." She did not mention Lily's journals. Not yet. She knew she had to speak his language first. "I do not dispute the initial MRI findings," she continued, swiping through images on her tablet. "But I believe the interpretation of those findings may have been incomplete. Dr. Harrison has diagnosed this as a case of static encephalopathy, a fixed, unchanging brain injury. But Emma's file shows subtle, anomalous responses to certain stimuli that are inconsistent with that diagnosis. I believe what we are looking at is not a dead end, but a dormant system. A profound neuromotor disconnection possibly triggered and exacerbated by a trauma feedback loop, but not necessarily irreversible." She spoke of dormant neural pathways, of neuroplasticity, of trauma-induced neurological states that mimic severe organic damage. She gave him a coherent, plausible scientific framework for what Jerome had called a locked room. She was translating the poetry into prose. Michael listened, his surgeon's mind dissecting every word, searching for flaws, for holes in her logic. He was torn. The theory was radical, bordering on the fringe, but it wasn't baseless. Chun was citing recent peer-reviewed studies he had only skimmed, research Harrison had always dismissed. For the first time, he was being presented with a scientific argument for hope. It's a compelling theory, Dr. Michael conceded, his voice tight. But it's based on interpreting anomalies. It's a long way from proof. That is why we are here, Janet said, her gaze firm. It was then that Jerome spoke for the first time. His quiet voice cut through the dense academic atmosphere of the room. He wasn't looking at the doctors. He was looking through the open study door into the living room where Emma sat in the afternoon light. The melody is quietest when the sun is on her face, he said. Michael and Chun turned to look at him. What did you say? Michael asked. Her melody, Jerome repeated, his eyes still fixed on Emma. It's the music her mind is trying to play. When the sun is bright, she gets very still. Her breathing gets shallow. It's almost gone. But on cloudy days or at night, it's stronger. There's a rhythm to her stillness. It's not empty. It's just listening. Michael stared at the boy. He thought back over the last 3 years, the endless hours he had spent watching her. He had noticed subconsciously that she always seemed more distant, more absent on bright sunny days. He had dismissed it as a trick of the light, a projection of his own moods. But the boy stated it as a simple, observable fact. And the music, Jerome continued, turning to face Michael, his dark eyes preternaturally wise. There is a piece of music. Your wife used to play it on the piano in that room. A simple one, like a lullaby. When you play it, a small muscle right here, he touched the corner of his own eye. It tightens in Emma's face. Every single time. It's a whisper. She's in there. She's just forgotten the sound of her own voice. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. The lullaby. A simple piece his late wife, who had died a year before Emma's regression, had composed for her. After her death, the silence in the house had become unbearable, so he had the piano removed. But in the early days, he had played a recording of it for Emma. And he had seen that flicker, that tiny contraction of the orbicularis oculi muscle. Harrison had assured him it was an insignificant reflex, a type of myoclonic jerk. But Jerome called it a whisper. He was standing on the edge of a cliff. Behind him was the solid, familiar ground of Harrison's certainty, a bleak and barren landscape, but a known one. Before him was a terrifying, unknown abyss, and this unlikely trio was asking him to jump armed with nothing but a radical theory, an old woman's whispers, and a little boy's impossible insight. To agree was to betray a colleague, risk his own reputation, and open himself up to a new and devastating kind of hope that could destroy him if it failed. But to refuse was to close the door on the only key he had ever been offered. He walked out of the study and into the living room, his colleagues following silently behind. He knelt before his daughter's wheelchair, taking her small, cool hand in his. He looked into her vacant blue eyes, searching for a sign, for a flicker of recognition, for anything. There was nothing, just the silence. But for the first time, it felt like the silence Jerome had described. Not an empty silence, but a listening one. He thought of his wife's lullaby. He thought of the flicker in her eye. He thought of the sun on her face. These were all data points he had collected and been told to discard. He stood up and turned to face them, the decision hardening within him. The father had finally won the war against the doctor. One night he said, his voice low and firm, resonating with the authority of a chief surgeon making a life-or-death call. I will get you into the old physiotherapy wing. It's deserted after hours. You will have one session. One chance to show me something. Anything. Something real and undeniable. He looked from Janet to Chun to Jerome, his gaze lingering on the boy. But if you are wrong, he continued, the words heavy with unspoken threat. This conversation never happened. You will never speak of this again to me or to anyone. And you will leave my daughter in peace. Are we clear? Janet and Chun both nodded, their faces pale with the gravity of his terms. Jerome simply said, she is the one who will show you Dr. Foster. All we have to do is listen. The hospital after midnight was another country, a place of long shadows and profound silence. The frantic life-and-death rhythm of the day gave way to a slow, quiet hum, the sound of machines breathing for the sleeping and the sick. Dr. Foster led their small clandestine procession through the deserted corridors, his key card granting them access to levels and wings that had long been relegated to storage and memory. Each beep and click of a locking mechanism echoed down the empty halls, amplifying their sense of transgression. They were ghosts in their own machine. Their destination was the old South Tower Physiotherapy Wing, a place that had been decommissioned a decade earlier when a newer, more advanced facility was built. The air that greeted them as Michael pushed open the heavy double doors was stale thick with the dust of disuse. The cavernous room was a graveyard of abandoned hope. Hulking, silent treadmills, parallel bars that led nowhere, and complex weight machines with cracked vinyl padding stood like forgotten idols in the gloom. This was a museum of loud medicine, a testament to the thousands of hours of brute mechanical force that had failed to heal. It was the perfect stage for a quiet revolution. The tension in the room was a palpable force. Michael felt as if his own heart were hooked up to a cardiac monitor, its frantic, hopeful, terrified rhythm visible for all to see. He was a surgeon, a man who commanded operating theaters with absolute authority. Yet here in this dusty, forgotten room, he was powerless, a mere spectator at the most important procedure of his life. Dr. Chun was all business, her nervousness channeled into brisk, efficient action. She set up a portable laptop and attached several small wireless sensors to Emma's forehead, wrists, and ankles. "I'll be monitoring her EEG, heart rate, and peripheral nerve responses," she explained, her voice a low, clinical whisper. She was their scientific witness, the objective eye required to validate any potential miracle. Janet Ever, the nurse, simply focused on the patient. She checked Emma's blanket, stroked her hair, and murmured soft, reassuring words. Her calm presence a steadying anchor in the swirling sea of anxiety. She had a quiet, unshakable faith that shone in her eyes. She was not here to witness an experiment. She was here to see a promise fulfilled. And then there was Jerome. In the center of all their adult anxieties, he was an island of pure, focused calm. He seemed oblivious to the high stakes, to the careers on the line, to the father's breaking heart. His entire universe had contracted to the small, silent girl in the wheelchair. "Could we turn off the overhead lights, please?" he asked softly. "And just use that lamp in the corner." Michael flicked the switches, and the harsh fluorescent glare was replaced by a single soft pool of golden light. The hulking machines receded into deep shadow, and the room became a more intimate, sacred space. Jerome then took a small, simple music player from his backpack and placed it on a nearby table. "What is that?" Michael asked, his voice tight. "Music my grandmother made," Jerome replied. "She said that every mind has a native rhythm. You just have to find the right frequency to wake it up." He pressed play. A simple melodic sound filled the room. It was not a lullaby. It was more elemental than that. It was a series of pure resonant tones, like a Tibetan singing bowl, arranged in a gentle repeating pattern that was hypnotic and deeply calming. The melody seemed to physically soften the tension in the air. Jerome knelt before Emma. He did not touch the diagnostic machines or the complex supports of her chair. Instead, he gently removed her shoes and socks. He took her small, cool, unresponsive feet into his hands. Foster watched his breath catching in his throat. This was it. The leap of faith. For a long time, nothing happened. Jerome closed his eyes, his thumbs beginning to move in slow, rhythmic circles on the soles of Emma's feet. He followed the rhythm of the music, his movements precise and intuitive. He was not applying force. He was communicating through touch, a silent conversation in a language older than words. He began to hum, a low, steady drone that matched the fundamental tone of the music. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Michael's initial fragile hope began to curdle into the familiar, bitter taste of disappointment. He glanced at Chun. She was staring intently at her screen, her expression neutral. Nothing. It wasn't working. It had all been a fantasy, the desperate projection of a grieving father and a traumatized child. He felt a fool for allowing it, for dragging them all here on such a wild and foolish chase. The silence in the room was no longer listening. It was mocking. He was about to speak, to call a halt to the painful charade, when Chun let out a sharp, barely audible gasp. "What?" Michael whispered, rushing to her side. She didn't answer. She just pointed a trembling finger at a single jagged line on the graph scrolling across her screen. There she breathed. The occipital lobe. A burst of coherent alpha wave activity. It's the brainwave pattern associated with a state of calm focus, like in meditation. I've never seen it on her EEG before. As Michael tried to process the information, Jerome spoke, his eyes still closed. "She's listening," he whispered. He shifted his attention from Emma's feet to her hands, his touch just as gentle, just as rhythmic. He began to tell a story, his voice soft and melodic, weaving in and out of the music. It was a simple story about a little bird with quiet wings who had forgotten how to fly, but who remembered that the wind had a song, and if she could just remember the song, her wings would remember the wind. And then it happened. It was so small, so insignificant that in any other context it would have gone unnoticed. The little toe on Emma's left foot, which had been still and lifeless for 3 years, flexed. It was a tiny, distinct movement, perfectly in time, with a soft chime in the music. Michael's heart stopped. He stared, not daring to breathe, sure it was a trick of the light, a phantom limb of his own desperate hope. "Did you see that?" He choked out, his eyes locked on his daughter's foot. "I saw it." Chun confirmed, her voice filled with a stunned scientific wonder. "And I've got a corresponding spike in the peripheral nerve monitor. It was not a random spasm. The signal originated in the motor cortex. It was voluntary." The word hung in the air, electric and impossible. Voluntary. Jerome, sensing the shift, the first crack in the wall of silence, opened his eyes. They were focused, filled with a gentle, encouraging light. He leaned closer to Emma, his voice a little stronger, a little more urgent. "That's it, Emma. You remember the song. The wind is waiting. Just a little more." Her fingers, which lay limp and curled in her lap, twitched. Then, with a visible, agonizing effort that made the cords in her neck stand out, the fingers of her right hand slowly, deliberately began to uncurl. One by one they straightened, reaching for nothing, reaching for everything. Tears were streaming down Michael's face, now hot and silent. He gripped the back of Chun's chair to keep himself from falling. This was more than he had allowed himself to dream of. This was a message from a world he had been told no longer existed. Jerome took Emma's newly opened hand in his. "You can hear me, Emma?" he said, his voice resonating with a loving authority. "You can hear the melody. Follow it home. Push against my hand. Show your father you're still here. Push." Michael watched, his entire being focused on the point of contact between the boy's hand and his daughter's. He saw the infinitesimal tremor in Emma's arm. He saw the fierce concentration that suddenly sharpened her vacant features, pulling them into a mask of pure, determined effort. For 3 years, her face had been a placid lake. Now a storm was raging just beneath the surface. Then, with a collective silent gasp from everyone in the room, it happened. She pushed. It was not a strong movement. It was a faint, trembling pressure, a flicker of renewed connection between mind and muscle. But it was undeniable. It was a conscious, coordinated, willed action. It was a whisper that roared louder than any sound he had ever heard. The effort exhausted her. Her hand went limp again, her face relaxed back into its familiar stillness. But it was a different stillness now. It was not the stillness of absence. It was the stillness of rest. The music played on its gentle tones, filling the sacred silence of the room. Jerome continued to hold Emma's hand, stroking it gently. Dr. Chun stared at her screens, which were now alight with data that defied every textbook she had ever read. And Dr. Michael Foster, the great surgeon, the man of science and facts, simply stood there, broken, and remade the tears of a father, finally able to grieve a loss that he now knew with impossible, miraculous certainty might not be a loss after all. The locked room had a key. The broken instrument had just played its first perfect note. The silence that followed the miracle was as profound and fragile as a newborn's first breath. It was a holy silence filled with the unspeakable weight of a prayer that had just been answered. Michael Foster was on his knees, his tall frame crumpled, his surgeon's hands, which had saved so many strangers, now clutching the small limp hand of his own daughter. He wasn't weeping with grief, but with a violent, purifying joy that shook his entire body. The years of cold, hollow despair were being washed away by a flood of impossible warmth. Dr. Chun was a whirlwind of controlled excitement, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her laptop. "The data is... it's perfect. she whispered, her voice trembling with the thrill of discovery. The correlation between the auditory tactile stimuli and the cortical response is 1-to-1. It's a perfect synaptic echo. It's beautiful. This isn't just therapy. It's a direct conversation with the subconscious. Janet simply stood by Emma's chair, her hand resting on the headrest, a silent, watchful guardian. A single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek, and her lips were curved in a soft, grateful smile. She was looking at Jerome, who was quietly winding the cord of his music player, his face serene, as if what had just occurred was the most natural thing in the world. He had not performed a miracle. He had simply delivered a message. It was a perfect, crystalline moment of triumph, a sacred circle of hope in a dusty, forgotten room. And then the doors burst open. The intrusion was a physical violation. The harsh, white, fluorescent light of the corridor sliced into their soft, golden sanctuary, and with it came the furious, imposing figure of Dr. Alan Harrison. He was still in his tailored suit from the day before, his hair slightly disheveled, his face a thunderous mask of rage. Behind him stood a nervous-looking night shift orderly, who immediately shrank back upon seeing the scene. "What in God's name is going on in here?" Harrison's voice was not a shout. It was a low, controlled roar that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He took in the scene with a sweep of his cold, furious eyes. Foster on the floor like a supplicant, Chun hunched over her laptop like a mad scientist, the old nurse standing guard, and the street kid, the source of this entire insurrection, at the center of it all. He didn't see a breakthrough. He saw a circus. He saw a mutiny. "I get a call from my staff that a chief surgeon, a junior neurologist, and a nurse have broken into a decommissioned wing in the middle of the night with an unauthorized civilian and a patient." He spat each word a pellet of ice. "I assume it's a mistake. A bad dream. But here you are. An illegal, unethical, and completely insane medical experiment." He strode into the room, his presence immediately sucking the warmth and hope from the air. He pointed a finger at Chun's laptop. "Shut that down, doctor. Whatever delusional fantasy you're documenting is over." He then sneered at Michael. "And you. Get up, Michael. Have you lost your mind? Subjecting your daughter to this charlatanism." His gaze finally fell on Jerome, and it was filled with a loathing so pure it was almost tangible. "I knew you were a cancer in this hospital," he hissed. "I should have had the police remove you permanently." But the man who rose from the floor was not the broken, pleading Michael Foster Harrison had been bullying for 3 years. The miracle, however small, had been a baptism of fire. It had burned away the doubt and despair, reforging his grief into a spine of pure, unyielding steel. He stood to his full height, his face tear-streaked but his eyes blazing with the cold, focused fury of a surgeon who had just seen a profound truth and would not allow it to be denied. "You will not speak to him that way." Alan Michael's voice was dangerously quiet, precise, and held the lethal calm of a scalpel's edge. "And you will not refer to what happened here as charlatanism." Harrison let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, and what would you call it? A miracle? Did the street shaman here perform a magic trick for the desperate father?" He gestured around the room. "This is not medicine. This is a pathetic emotional spectacle. I'm sure you all imagined you saw something. A twitch. A spasm. It's called emotional contagion. It was a voluntary, coordinated motor response initiated in the cerebral cortex." Dr. Chun's voice cut in sharp and clear. She stood up, tablet in hand, her nervousness gone, replaced by the righteous certainty of a scientist who has just witnessed a paradigm shift. "I have the EEG and the peripheral nerve response data to prove it. It is quantifiable, replicable, and it is the single most significant clinical event in this patient's history. Data you collected during an unsanctioned and deeply unethical procedure," Harrison shot back. "It's inadmissible. It's the work of a hysterical, insubordinate resident who has been unduly influenced by a senile nurse and a disturbed child." This was Harrison's method: attack, discredit, and overwhelm. But this time his targets did not flinch. "She is not senile, she is experienced," Michael countered, his voice like ice. "He is not disturbed, he is gifted. And you, Alan, are blind. You have been blind for years." The accusation, so direct, so personal, seemed to stun Harrison into a moment of silence. It was in that moment that Dr. Chun stepped forward, closing the circle. This was no longer just a defense. It was an offensive. "Dr. Harrison," she began, her tone formal, the voice of a physician making a declaration for the record. What we have witnessed here tonight is not an anomaly. I believe it is a direct confirmation of a therapeutic pathway you have systematically ignored and suppressed for at least 15 years. Harrison's face, already flushed with anger, began to pale. That is a slanderous and career-ending accusation, Doctor. Is it? Chun's finger tapped the screen of her tablet. Because I am looking at data tonight that is profoundly consistent with the private clinical notes of Nurse Lily Williams, specifically regarding her work with a patient named Daniel R., a case in which you were the attending physician. A case where Nurse Williams documented a full recovery using these exact same non-invasive neurostimulative techniques, a recovery you subsequently erased from the official hospital record, choosing instead to file it as transferred against medical advice. The unmasking had begun. The name Lily Williams was a bomb that detonated in the center of the room. Harrison visibly recoiled as if he had been physically struck. His carefully constructed facade of unflappable authority began to crack. A small, almost imperceptible tick started in his left eyelid. You have no idea what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice losing its baritone confidence, becoming thin and reedy. "I'm talking about a pattern of willful diagnostic blindness." Chun pressed on her voice, ringing with the clarity of truth. "A pattern of prioritizing a rigid, outdated methodology over direct patient observation. A pattern of choosing to label a child as a hopeless case rather than admitting the possibility of a reality that exists outside your textbooks. You didn't just fail to heal Emma, Dr. Harrison. You actively stood in the way of her healing. You stood in Daniel's way before her. How many others have there been?" Harrison was unraveling. His professional mask, the one he had worn for decades, was crumbling away, revealing the terrified, arrogant man beneath. He was a king whose subjects had just discovered he had no clothes, and his castle was built not on knowledge, but on fear, the fear of being wrong. This is a conspiracy," he sputtered, looking wildly from Foster to Chun to Janet. "A mutiny organized by a group of unstable emotional—" Enough. Michael Foster's voice was the sound of a gavel falling, a final, irrevocable judgment. He stepped between Harrison and his daughter, a human shield of absolute conviction. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely and permanently inverted. "You came here to find a circus," Alan Michael said, his voice quiet but every word a devastating blow. "But what you found was hope. Something you are clearly unable to recognize as a valid clinical outcome. You are relieved of my daughter's care. Effective immediately. Now get out of this room." The words, so quiet, so final, destroyed what little was left of Harrison's authority. He stood there exposed and sputtering in the middle of the dusty room, a relic of an old and broken medicine. He had been unmasked not by a board of his peers, but by a child's whisper, a nurse's memory, a doctor's courage, and a father's love. Harrison did not leave quietly. His exit was a detonation of pure, impotent rage. "You will all regret this," he roared, his voice echoing in the vast, empty wing. "I will have your licenses. Foster, you are an emotional wreck, unfit to make medical decisions. Chun, your career in this city is over, and I will see to it that this street child is placed in a facility so deep, he will never see the light of day again." He stormed out, the heavy doors swinging shut behind him, leaving a toxic silence in his wake. The euphoria of their small miracle was gone, replaced by the cold, stark reality of the war that had just been declared. They had won a battle, but Harrison was retreating to the fortress of the hospital's administration, and he was preparing to use its full power to crush them. "He'll do it," Chun said, her face pale, the scientific excitement replaced by a grim pragmatism. "He'll call an emergency board meeting for the morning. He'll frame this as a catastrophic breach of ethics. He will destroy us before we even have a chance to present what we've found." Michael Foster, however, was no longer just a father. He was a commander. The years of leading surgical teams through complex, life-threatening crises took over. His grief had made him passive. His hope had made him a warrior. "No, he won't," Michael said, his voice hard and resolute. "He thinks he's the only one with power in this hospital. He's forgotten who I am." He pulled out his phone. "Janet, get Emma home and stay with her. Jerome, you're with me. Chun, go back to your office. Turn your data from tonight into the most rigorous, airtight, and damning scientific presentation you have ever created. Don't focus on Harrison. Focus on Emma. Show the data, present the hypothesis, and prove the result. I'm going to make some calls. Alan wants a judgment from our peers." "Fine. By sunrise he'll have one. What followed was a race against the dawn. The next 6 hours were a blur of frantic, focused activity. In her lab, Dr. Chun worked with a ferocious intensity, translating the jagged lines on her EEG graphs and the raw numbers from her nerve monitors into elegant, undeniable charts. She wove them into a formal presentation, a powerful scientific narrative of a breakthrough that Harrison had not only missed, but had actively suppressed. In Michael's study, he and Jerome huddled over Lily Williams's journals. With Jerome as his guide, Michael entered his mother-in-law's mind, a place he had respected but never truly understood. He saw for the first time the genius in her observations, the rigor in her methods. Guided by Jerome, they found and bookmarked not just Daniel's case, but 3 others, all children with different diagnoses, who had been dismissed by the formal medical staff, all of whom Lily had secretly helped, documenting her work with meticulous care. Meanwhile, Michael worked the phones with the precision of a master surgeon. He called the hospital's CEO at home, waking him up and demanding his presence. He called the head of the ethics committee, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who valued the hospital's reputation above all else. He called 2 of the oldest and most respected members of the board of directors, men who remembered the legend of Lily Williams firsthand. He didn't plead or accuse. He simply stated that a significant clinical event had occurred regarding his daughter, that Dr. Harrison's professional conduct was now under serious question, and that for the good of the hospital, they all needed to meet in the main boardroom at 7 a.m. He was leveraging every ounce of the political capital he had earned over 20 years of service. The boardroom at Chicago Memorial was a place designed to intimidate. It was a cold, cavernous room on the top floor, with a 20-foot-long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, and a wall of glass that offered a sweeping, godlike view of the city below. By 7 a.m., it was filled with the most powerful people in the hospital. Dr. Harrison, looking composed and immaculate in a fresh suit, presented his case first. He was masterful. He spoke with the calm, rational authority of a man deeply concerned for his institution's integrity. He painted a vivid picture of a beloved colleague, Dr. Foster, understandably broken by grief and rendered emotionally unstable. He described Dr. Chun as a talented but dangerously ambitious junior physician, eager to make a name for herself with reckless fringe theories. He portrayed Janet as a well-meaning but sentimental nurse easily manipulated. And Jerome he dismissed as a deeply troubled, manipulative child who had somehow preyed upon this perfect storm of grief and ambition. What occurred last night, Harrison concluded, his voice resonating with grave concern, was not medicine. It was a violation. A violation of protocol, a violation of ethics, and most tragically, a violation of a vulnerable patient. For the safety of our patients and the reputation of this hospital, I am asking for the immediate suspension of Dr. Chun and Nurse Miller, and for Dr. Foster to be placed on a mandatory leave of absence to address his personal crisis. He sat down, leaving a heavy, damning silence in his wake. He had presented a narrative that was logical, coherent, and terrifying. Then it was their turn. Dr. Chun stood, and with the cool precision of a research scientist, she presented her findings. She showed the board Emma's baseline data from the past 3 years, flat, unresponsive, hopeless. Then she showed them the data from the night before. She showed the charts where Emma's brainwave activity exploded in direct, perfect correlation to Jerome's stimuli. She showed the nerve conduction data that proved the movements were voluntary. What this data suggests, she said, her voice clear and unwavering, is that we may have been fundamentally misinterpreting this patient's condition. I am not presenting a cure. I am presenting evidence of a previously undiscovered neurological potential that warrants immediate and rigorous further study. Next, Michael stood. He did not speak as a surgeon. He spoke as a father. He told them of the 3 years of crushing silence. He described the miracle he had witnessed, the conscious, deliberate pressure of his daughter's hand. For 3 years I have been told to accept the science, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And last night, I finally saw it. The science of a human being trying to come back to us. The only difference is that science wasn't found in a machine or a textbook. It was found by a boy who was wise enough to listen. Harrison scoffed, sensing his moment to strike. Listen to what? This is absurd. We are a world-class medical institution, and we are sitting here discussing the medical opinions of a 10-year-old runaway. What can he possibly know? What are his credentials? His credentials, Janet's voice cut through the room strong and clear, are in this book. She placed one of Lily Williams's journals on the gleaming mahogany table. The older board members leaned forward, recognition in their eyes. The name still held power in this hospital. This is preposterous. Harrison blustered, his composure finally cracking. The ramblings of a long-retired nurse. Let's find out, said the CEO. His gaze fixed on the book. He looked at Jerome. Son, is there something in there you'd like to show us? Jerome, who had been silent throughout the entire meeting, stood. He was not intimidated by the powerful people or the cavernous room. He walked to the table, opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon, and in the profound silence he began to read. His voice was clear and steady. He was reading from an entry dated 15 years prior from the case file of Daniel R. The boy is not broken, Jerome read, quoting his grandmother's words. He is trapped behind a wall of fear, and Dr. H's aggressive impersonal methods are only making the wall thicker. The young doctor is brilliant, but he cannot see the patient for the diagnosis. He is so certain of what his books have told him that he is blind to the truth standing right in front of him. I fear for this boy, but I fear more for the children who will come after him. This doctor's pride is a disease, and until it is challenged, his patients will never be truly healed. Jerome looked up from the page, his dark, quiet eyes finding Harrison's across the long table. He didn't need to say another word. Lily Williams, a legend of their own hospital, had just reached across time and delivered her verdict. She had diagnosed the true disease in the room. The boardroom was utterly silent. The prophetic accuracy of the passage describing with chilling precision the exact behavior Harrison had just displayed was irrefutable. It was no longer the word of a child against a department head. It was the legacy of one of their own most respected healers against a man who had just been exposed as a tyrant. Harrison was ashen, his mouth opening and closing, but no sounds came out. He had been so meticulously unmasked that there was nothing left to say. The CEO of the hospital, a man known for his calm and deliberate manner, slowly stood up. He looked at Harrison, and his eyes were chips of ice. Dr. Harrison, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You are suspended effective immediately. A committee will be formed to conduct a full and formal investigation, not only into your handling of the Emma Foster case, but into every patient you have ever deemed a hopeless cause. The judgment of his peers had been delivered. And it was absolute. The judgment, once delivered, was executed with the swift, impersonal efficiency of a surgical procedure. Dr. Alan Harrison, who had strode into the boardroom that morning, a king, was escorted out by hospital security like a common trespasser. He was a man hollowed out, the intricate scaffolding of his pride and authority, dismantled in a single hour, leaving nothing but a fragile, sputtering rage. The news of his suspension spread through the hospital's communication channels, first as a series of urgent coded emails between department heads, then as a torrent of hushed whispers and shocked gasps rippling through the nursing stations, the labs, and the cafeterias. An old and unassailable institution within the hospital had crumbled into dust before breakfast. In the wake of his departure, the four victors were left alone in the vast, silent boardroom. The adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving a profound and sober exhaustion. They had won. It was a victory for Emma, for Lily's legacy, and for truth itself. But it was a victory born of trauma and conflict, and the emotional cost hung heavy in the air. Dr. Chun sank into one of the plush leather chairs, her face pale. Janet leaned against the wall, her eyes closed as if in a silent prayer of thanks. Michael Foster stood at the great window looking down at the city, not as a master of his universe, but as a man who had just navigated his ship through a hurricane and was only now beginning to assess the damage. He turned and looked at Jerome, who was standing quietly by the table, his hand resting on his grandmother's journal. In the sterile corporate grandeur of the room, the boy looked small, vulnerable, and utterly out of place. And in that moment, Michael saw him with a blinding, painful clarity. He saw not a prodigy, not a key, not a catalyst for change, but a lonely, orphaned child who had carried the weight of a sacred promise, who had faced down a powerful man, and who had given his family back its future. And he had done it all while having no family of his own. The professional crisis was over. The human one was now paramount. That evening, the silence in Michael Foster's house was different. It was no longer the oppressive silence of despair, but the gentle, peaceful quiet of convalescence. Emma was asleep in her room, Janet having stayed to help get her settled. In the study, the same room where their conspiracy had been forged, Michael sat opposite Jerome. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light on their faces. "I can never repay you for what you've done for Emma Michael," began his voice, low and thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "To give a father back his daughter. There is no currency for that. No words." Jerome simply nodded, his eyes on the fire. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for her. And for my grandmother." "I know," Michael said. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "And that is why this isn't about repayment. This is about what comes next. For you. You are 10 years old, Jerome. You have shouldered a burden that would have crushed most men. You deserve a chance to put that burden down. You deserve a chance to be a child, to be safe, to be home." He took a deep breath. "I would be honored," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "if you would let me be your legal guardian. If you would let this be your home. Not as a guest or a hero, but as a son." The offer hung in the quiet room, as real and as fragile as the flames in the hearth. It was not a reward, it was a plea. A request from one lonely man to another lonely boy to try and build a family from the ashes of their shared ordeal. Jerome was silent for a long time. He looked around the beautiful book-lined room, then his gaze drifted towards the hallway that led to Emma's bedroom. He was no longer just a guardian of a legacy. He was a part of a life, a real tangible life, that was just beginning to heal. A small, slow smile touched his lips. "Does that mean I have to take out the trash?" he asked. The simple, childish question broke the tension, and for the first time in years, a real deep laugh erupted from Michael Foster. It was the sound of a seed of joy taking root in long, barren soil. The next day, Michael returned to the hospital, not just as a surgeon, but as an architect of the future. He met again with the CEO and the board. The hospital was in damage control mode. The investigation into Harrison's files was already unearthing a disturbing pattern of similar cases, a potential legal and public relations catastrophe. They needed to get ahead of the story to show that the institution was not just purging a corrupt element, but reforming itself. This was the opening Michael had been waiting for. Dr. Harrison was not the disease, Michael told the assembled executives. He was a symptom of a culture that has at times valued dogma over discovery and authority over empathy. Firing him is not enough. We have to create something new. We have to prove that we have learned from our failure. He laid out his vision. He proposed the creation of a new independent institute within the hospital, funded by a significant portion of the neurology department's budget. It would not be named after a wealthy donor, but after the quiet nurse whose wisdom they had ignored for far too long. He called it the Lily Williams Center for Integrative Neurology. Its mission would be revolutionary. It would be a place where the rigorous data-driven science of neurologists like Dr. Chun would work hand in hand with the holistic, intuitive, patient-centered methods pioneered by Lily Williams. It would be a place for the hospital's most challenging, hopeless cases. It would turn their greatest shame into their most profound innovation. The board, recognizing the genius of the proposal, a way to transform a scandal into a pioneering medical triumph, agreed immediately and unanimously. Dr. Rebecca Chun was named the center's inaugural director, a stunning promotion that sent a clear message through the entire hospital. The era of Harrison was over, and the age of innovation had begun. They also addressed the question of Jerome. He was not to be a mascot or a case study. Michael insisted on it. The board agreed to fund a unique, fully customized educational path for him. He would be enrolled in the city's best private school for his core education, but he would also have a formal position at the new center, founding consultant and research scholar. Dr. Chun would be his official mentor, tasked with designing a curriculum that would give him the formal scientific education he needed to complement and contextualize his extraordinary intuitive gifts. They were not just giving him a home, they were giving him a future, ensuring that the seed of his grandmother's legacy would be planted in the richest possible soil. The chapter did not end with a press conference or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It ended a week later in the dusty, silent physiotherapy wing where the miracle had occurred. Michael, Jerome, and Dr. Chun stood together in the center of the room. Emma was there with them, Janet standing beside her wheelchair. The air was no longer stale with disuse, but electric with potential. "This is it," Michael said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "This is where it begins. The contractors start tomorrow. We're tearing down all the old machines and we're letting in the light. He was no longer just talking about the room. As he spoke, Emma, who had been quietly watching Jerome, slowly lifted her right hand. The movement was more fluid than it had been a week ago, more confident. She reached out her small fingers, unfurling in a clear, unmistakable gesture towards the boy who had taught her to listen to her own music. Jerome stepped forward and gently took her hand in his. A new beginning in a place of old ghosts. The first seed had been planted. The harvest of healing was about to begin. 1 year later, the space that had once been a tomb of forgotten medical machinery was now a cathedral of light. The Lily Williams Center for Integrative Neurology was not just a renovation of a physical space, it was the manifestation of a new philosophy. The heavy, imposing machines were gone. In their place were rooms filled with natural sunlight, vibrant green plants, and walls painted in soft, calming colors. The air, once thick with the scent of dust and decay, now smelled faintly of chamomile and cedarwood. And most importantly, the oppressive silence had been replaced by the sound of quiet music, gentle encouragement, and on the best of days, the miraculous sound of children's laughter. The center had become the hospital's soul, a place that was gaining a quiet but powerful national reputation. It was a beacon for families who had been told to give up hope, a last resort that was quickly becoming a first choice for those seeking a different kind of healing. Emma Foster, now 8 years old, was the living embodiment of that healing. Her walk was not perfect. A slight lingering limp in her left leg was a permanent reminder of the years she had lost, but it was strong, confident, and entirely her own. She moved through the center with a sense of purpose, her blue eyes, once vacant, now sharp and filled with a profound empathy that was far beyond her years. She had become the center's unofficial welcoming committee. She was in the main activity room now, sitting on the floor beside a new arrival, a 5-year-old boy named Leo, who had not spoken a word since a traumatic accident 6 months prior. He was curled into a tight ball, his face hidden, refusing to interact with the therapists or even his own parents. The doctors at his previous hospital had prepared his parents for a lifetime of institutional care. Emma did not try to make him talk. She simply sat beside him, humming the simple, resonant melody that Jerome had played on that first fateful night. She took out a small, smooth wooden bird from her pocket and began to make it dance in the air, telling it a quiet story. The little bird was scared of the sky. She whispered, her voice soft enough that only Leo could hear. It was so big and loud. He forgot his song, but he didn't know the sky was waiting to hear it. For 20 minutes, the boy remained a motionless knot of fear. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, his head turned a single inch in her direction. It was a tiny movement, a flicker of curiosity in a world that had been shut down. From across the room, Leo's parents watched, tears streaming down their faces. For them, it was a bigger miracle than the first man walking on the moon. Jerome, now an 11-year-old on the cusp of adolescence, watched the scene with a quiet, knowing smile. His life had transformed. He was a son, a brother, and a student. He was thriving in the challenging academic environment of his new school, his sharp mind soaking up science, history, and literature. But his real education happened here in the center that bore his grandmother's name. He now moved between two worlds, the intuitive and the analytical, with a grace that astonished everyone who knew him. He was in the diagnostic room with Dr. Chun, looking at the vibrant, complex images of Leo's brain scans on a large monitor. The trauma appears to have created a hypervigilant state in the amygdala, Chun explained, pointing to a brightly lit area on the scan. It's a constant neurological feedback loop of fear. We can try to dampen it with medication, but the side effects... His color is gray, Jerome said, his eyes not on the scan, but on the boy in the other room. But it's a shiny gray, like a wet stone. It's not a dead color. The fear isn't who he is. It's just a loud noise that's blocking out his music. Chun nodded, taking his words as seriously as any peer-reviewed paper. This was their process, a fusion of two languages. Jerome's intuitive, poetic descriptions would provide a direction, a human context to the cold, hard data. Chun would then use her scientific knowledge to formulate a testable strategy. So if it's a noise, she mused, we don't need to silence it with a drug. We need to introduce a stronger, calmer frequency to override it. She began typing, designing a new therapy protocol for Leo, based on specific sound frequencies, rhythmic light patterns, and the gentle touch therapies from Lily's journals. It was a prescription for hope, co-written by a brilliant neurologist and the boy who spoke in melodies. The center's success had begun to plant new seeds throughout the hospital. Surgeons, including Michael Foster himself, began incorporating music and mindfulness techniques into their pre- and post-operative care, noticing a marked improvement in patient recovery times. The oncology department started a new program based on Lilly's herbal tea remedies to help patients manage the side effects of chemotherapy. The whisper of Lilly's quiet medicine was becoming a conversation, a new harmony that was fundamentally changing the culture of Chicago Memorial. It was becoming a place that remembered how to heal, not just how to treat. Michael Foster was a man transformed. The hollow, haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of purpose. He still performed surgeries, but his true passion was his work as the chairman of the Lilly Williams Center's foundation. He had become a tireless advocate, a fundraiser, and a storyteller, ensuring that the legacy that saved his daughter would be able to save countless others. The final scene of this chapter of their lives took place late one afternoon, a few weeks later. Jerome and Emma were with Leo in one of the therapy rooms. Chun's protocol was in action. A soft, pulsating light filled the room, and a low, rhythmic hum, like the sound of a cello, vibrated gently through the floor. Jerome was guiding Leo's hands through a basin of cool water, while Emma was on the other side, building a small tower of soft, colorful blocks. They did not ask him to speak. They did not pressure him at all. They simply created a space of absolute safety, a world where the loud noise of fear was finally drowned out by a stronger symphony of peace. Leo, who had not initiated a single action in 6 months, slowly reached his hand out of the water and placed it on top of a red block on Emma's tower. It was his first choice, his first independent mark on the world since his accident. Emma beamed a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. Jerome caught his eye and nodded, a shared understanding passing between them. The whisper had been heard. From the observation window, Michael and Rebecca Chun watched. They saw not just a single small victory, but the beautiful, undeniable proof of their new world. They saw a brother and sister forged in crisis now acting as healers. They saw the legacy of a wise old woman carried on by the children she had in essence saved. They saw the harvest of a seed that had been planted in the dark, now growing impossibly and magnificently toward the light. This was not an ending, it was a beginning. In the end, this was a story about the different kinds of silence. There is the cold, empty silence of despair, the one that lived in Dr. Foster's house and in Emma's eyes. But there is also a different kind of silence, a listening silence, the one a wise grandmother taught her grandson to hear. It is the silence that holds the truth, the one that contains the quiet melody of hope that can be found in every human heart, no matter how lost or broken it may seem. This story is a reminder that the loudest voice in the room is not always the wisest, and that true profound healing often begins when we finally become quiet enough to listen. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If the story of Jerome and Emma touched your heart, we invite you to support our channel for more stories that celebrate courage, compassion, and the quiet power of hope. We are grateful for your time and your attention. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our community. It allows us to continue sharing tales that remind us that the most extraordinary miracles are often found in the most unexpected of places.